Alright guys, so this is the second video I put out for beginning welders, showing you some ideas on stuff to practice if you're getting ready to weld. You want to know where to start. Last video we did a butt weld on 1/8 inch steel with a little V in it and a small root gap. If you haven't seen that video, go ahead and go back. It should be in a series, so you should be able to go back and see that. Give you some ideas. This video, I'm going to be using some thinner metal because I don't have a lot of this left over, but I have a bunch of this. These are actual plates that you'll be welding in an iCar welding test if you're going to be working on cars. In this video, what I'm going to go over is a little bit about overlap and get into a little bit about a T-weld or an angle weld. As you can see, these plates are clean. I cleaned them with wax and grease remover, and then I sanded them down with a fine grit grinding disc sanding pad. Make sure all the paints and oils are off of them. Always get the oils off first. If you try and get the paint off and there's oil in it, you're going to grind the oil into the metal. You don't want anything on the metal when you go to weld it. You're going to get contamination in your weld. It's not going to be a solid weld. Depending on what you're using it for, you might have to grind out the weld and re-weld it if it's too far contaminated and you're using it for structure. So be careful with the metal that you're going to weld. So a little bit about an overlap weld, which is when you have a little bit of an overlap. Not much. I mean, you might have, depending on how much you have, how much material you have on your two panels, you might have a pretty good overlap. What you want to do is have a nice hot bead on top. You want to concentrate right in that groove. You're going to want to have a lot of penetration back here too. Good amount of penetration. That means that your weld is all the way through the metal and it's holding it together real good. If you don't have any penetration, your weld might not be sticking to this back panel. It might just be that you're too far on top and you're just welding the top panel. So make sure you're angled right in that groove and getting a lot of penetration on the back side. So I've got my plate that I use as a ground. It keeps me from having to clamp this to the piece of metal itself. It gives me a surface. It'd be great if I had a big metal table that I could ground to, but I don't have one. So I take this, I have this little bent piece hanging off the edge, I attach my ground to that, and that makes this whole plate of ground. We'll take these two pieces of metal, line them up. Doesn't really matter how far your overlap is. As far as welder setup, if you're using the same thickness of metal to do your butt weld as your overlap, you're going to want to turn it up a little bit because you don't have that root gap, that space between them. You got to get good penetration on that bottom piece of metal. Let's tack weld these together. Now that we've got our tack welds here and here on the edges, we're going to put a bead right across here. Now our gun's going to be angled this way to get the heat into that groove. You're going to want to point it right in there. Don't just put the heat on the top piece. You won't get penetration on the bottom piece. Don't point it just on the bottom one. As you're welding, you should be able to see this top piece getting welded to the bottom one. And try and keep your heat right in there. right there is not too bad. Not too shabby. It's a little cold over here. See how it's not quite, it's kind of humped up a little bit too high. Not quite penetrating on the bottom piece of metal there. But as you come across, it heats up. It's not too tall. On the back side, got some good penetration coming through here. That means that metal is welded. Really solid on there. That's the problem with a lot of my welds, is I don't get that penetration at the very first part. I'm not a perfect welder, but it'll get you started. You can always do better than me. We'll do a couple welds on the back side. We'll see if I can speed up a little bit and show you what a fast weld looks like, and slow down and show you what a slow weld looks like. So this one was run pretty fast. It's really small. If you can see the lines, you can see a V to the line. You don't want a sharp V. You want a nice circle. You want the top of your weld to look like a circle. Piece of metal is getting kind of warm. There's not quite a lot of penetration. You can see a little bit of heat transfer, but there's no buildup there. You want to see a little bit of buildup, just like on this one. A little bit of slag on there. You gotta watch that stuff as your weld will cool. That'll pop off there. You always want to have safety glasses on when that cools. Now, trying to slow down a little bit. I'm not too good at slowing down or speeding up, either one. It's a pretty decent weld. It's built up a little bit too high. I don't know if you can see it, if you can tell in the video. It's kind of high. Wasn't going fast enough. It's got a nice round to it as far as the pattern. It's got nice penetration, probably a little bit too much penetration back there. That's more than we like to see. And it heated the metal up so hot, it warped it. So you don't want to heat the metal up so hot you warp it. A lot of times with I-car, they'll tell you to weld an inch and then skip an inch. And weld an inch and skip an inch. That keeps that metal from heating up too hot. The next one we'll work on is a T-weld, an angle weld. One thing I will have to warn you about on this one, the heat of the weld is it's gonna want to pull this top piece of metal. It's gonna want to warp it. As that weld cools, it shrinks and it puts stress on it, on the metal. If you can, you want to try and compensate for this. If you're going to weld this side, maybe instead of having it straight up, you have it lean back just a little bit. So that way when you weld it, it pulls it just a little bit, maybe a degree. Pulls it straight up. If not, clamp it really good. Wherever you've got your work, put some clamps on it, a couple vices, whatever you can do. Keep that straight up, otherwise it's going to want to pull. Welding this side, it's going to want to pull it this way. That right there is pretty close to straight up and down. You can see that in that video or not. Maybe sort of somewhat. Pretty close. Now when you're welding this, you're going to want your heat a little bit on the top piece, and you're going to want to drag it down into the bottom piece. A little bit of movement with the welder helps out a lot. Kind of a weaving pattern, maybe top to bottom. Yeah, that worked pretty good. Pulled it right over. And if you can see it, but it's not straight at that end anymore. It's leaning this way. With thin sheet metal, you can just tap it back. When you're working with thicker metal, you're not going to have the ability to tap it back. You can see this weld here. Nice and smooth, sitting in the groove right there real nice. A little bit of warpage on that bottom piece, a little bit hot. But I don't see any penetration back here. And I don't see any penetration back here. I like to see a little bit more penetration on my welds. So that's telling me right there I'd have to turn my welder up a little bit or slow down a little bit. So we'll shoot another weld on this side right here. See if we can get better penetration. That's a little bit nicer, I think. A little bit smoother. A little bit of penetration back there. See it right there in that crack. A little tiny bit. But we've got better penetration on the bottom. You can really see it kind of coming through. Really warped that piece of metal now. That's what heat does. It's what welds do. You can see from here to here, it shrunk it this way. When that weld cooled, it pulled it that way. And then over here, this is apart because it shrunk it on this side, pulled it this way. Try and keep that in mind when you're welding. You're making a project, and you don't want to have it look like that. You don't want to have to beat it back straight. Two things you can do to minimize that. You can tack weld it. You can tack weld it over here, and that'll help hold it. Other than that, try and use a vise, some vice grips maybe, hold it in place, and keep those vices on there until that piece of metal is cold. that piece of metal is completely cold, you take it out of the vise, take it out of the clamps, better chance of it staying straight. So if you got a little bit of time, practice the overlap weld that I threw over there on the floor, the two pieces. Practice that weld right there. Look at the penetration on the back side and make sure it's not too high on the top side. And your angle weld, make sure it looks nice and pretty in that groove. You got a little bit of penetration on the back side. If you have thicker metal, if you're working with thicker metal, you're going to want to bevel it like the first video. This, I think this is 18 gauge, maybe a smidge thinner. I don't bevel anything this thin because it has a tendency to just melt away, and then there's a hole there and you're trying to patch holes up on your way. It's a pain in the butt. But if you're getting stuff thicker, like this 1/8 inch, bevel it. You'll have an easier time getting penetration. If you guys haven't subscribed yet, hit that subscribe button. I'll have another video out in a little while. Hit that like button. Help this video get seen by a lot more people. Until next time, take it easy, guys. Wear your safety equipment. Go out and make something.